Welcome back to the Happy Cynics, everybody. My name is Isaac, the all-seeing eye, and with me is DJ Dr. K.
Oh,
In the last episode, we were discussing the commons, and so we're going to continue our discussion of the commons and talk about the different modern aspects that we could adopt from the medieval commons system.
yes.
And the different religious aspects that we might think about as well.
All right. Sounds good. Sounds uncommonly good, as they say at Keebler.
I hope our podcast is uncommonly good, even if it is a common good. Also, all of you listeners owe us. You need to have a stake in this common good.
Yes, that's right. Have a steak. Yes. So we were talking about the function of the common goods. I guess where's a good place to start? What should the common goods look like today?
Yeah. Well, I think
I don't know that like a plot of land that everybody works would necessarily be the thing.
it might work in some places.
Yeah.
But I don't think in modern, like at least American society, that would be the best application. We're a mostly urbanized society. But when I think about, like, I have some pretty strong political opinions, I think, about the commons and what counts as the commons, and they stem from my understanding of the Constitution of America.
Okay.
Which is that everybody has a right to life first, right?
Right.
Not to go to the right to life argument, but that part, for me, having a right to life implies that you have a right to the means to live. And I think those are properly understood as commons.
And it's interesting that you bring that up, that John Locke actually said that the three basic civil rights were life, liberty, and the ownership of property.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and when he says property, for Locke at least, he's talking about the fruit of labor as property.
Right. Right.
Because part of and this gets brought up again when we're going to talk about Wesley, because Wesley lived through the death of the commons. Mm-hmm. And Wesley and Locke sort of have an exchange over the right to property. We can save that for later if you don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now.
I don't care.
But
we can go we can do that now or later, either one, whatever you think is. Well, just go ahead. You already mentioned it.
Yeah, might as well.
Yeah.
To me, this is the bridge between like modern civil right to life commons and the sort of religious aspects of interpreting the Bible in ancient Christianity.
Okay.
Because Locke sees that property isn't really natural, right? You can't take it with you when you die.
Right.
The creation is given to mankind to hold in common. This is what Wesley talks about in conjunction with Locke as well.
Mm-hmm.
However, property is assigned to people as like stewards of certain pieces of property. And that's for Wesley. For Locke, property comes from the one thing that humanity brings to creation is labor. Mm-hmm. So you should be able to appropriate the goods of your own labor. Right. And I think I agree with both of them.
Yeah.
That you shouldn't be alienated from the products of your labor, which is, to bring up the Marxism stuff again.
Right.
But also that property is sort of a social illusion, because you really can't take it with you. You are really just a steward for a time. And we tend not to think that way when we talk about like, well, it's my property. I can do with it what I want to. But you are beholden to those who will come after to manage that property with them in mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, rights themselves are really kind of meaningless unless they're basically respected by everybody in society. And that's really what it is. So when you own a piece of property, you own a car or a house, it's just society has agreed that when you have this some kind of proof of ownership, well, then it's yours to use. It's not, it's up to you whether you let others use it or not.
Right.
So that's really kind of what it is. It's a social convention where, and even when Locke is talking about property, part of it is, yes, the right to attain what you've like to keep and control what you've attained legally, whether it's given to you or you've earned it or inherited it or whatever. But the other part is like a right to privacy. So by having property, you have this right to your own personal life that's not open to public scrutiny.
Right. Well, and it's interesting thinking about like medieval open field commons, is that housing was built on the borders of this commons, but the housing wasn't held in common. Housing was built on the commons.
Okay. Right.
So there is like precedent to connect that idea to modern day ideas of like property and privacy, while also maintaining that there are some things that are not rightly property.
Right.
Or at least like they're not like public property. The commons are not public property. Not anybody can come use them. They are communal property belonging to a particular community.
Right. Yeah, it's similar to say like in the years ago where they used to have these like housing or apartment like tenements where, you know, nobody had enough to have their own bathroom and their own private plumbing. So like several families like lived next door to each other in these string of places. And then there was maybe one or two bathrooms that everybody shared. And you had to take turns using it, you know. But
the question that like sort of I'm posing is, if you have a right to live,
right,
you have a right to the means to live as well.
Okay,
that means like I'm thinking Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right.
So water, food, shelter, that you need those to be alive.
Right.
I would also throw in medical care.
Yes. Now,
and some form of community as well.
Okay. So, all right. Now here's a question I'll throw back to you. So does everybody have a right to those goods, or does everybody have a right to a means to attain those goods? So for example, I've got in mind like the difference between FDR liberalism and LBJ liberalism. So in Roosevelt's New Deal, he didn't just give money or food stamps or whatever to people. He gave them jobs so they could earn money to be able to buy the goods and services they needed. Johnson created the welfare state in his Great Society, and this is where I guess I start sounding a little more like a conservative. Maybe. I think everybody has the right. So the right to life doesn't mean that. Okay, so let me frame it this way. All right. In terms of moral philosophy, and I know you know this, but for the benefit of our listeners, they talk about duties, and they distinguish duties like a positive duty where you have an obligation to do something versus a negative duty where you're obligated to not do certain things. They also have what are called imperfect and perfect duties. A perfect duty is one that is so strong that it generates a right for the other party. So if I have a duty, or let's put it this way, my duty to not harm somebody is strong enough that it generates or corresponds with their right to life. Now, it's different to say, okay, if somebody says I have a right to life, obviously I have a duty to not do anything to threaten their life, that person's life. But that's not the same as I have a duty to sustain that person's life. And so I guess my question would be, do you feel that that duty is strong enough that, let's say, do I just basically give somebody the opportunity where they can take care of themselves, or do we have an obligation? I mean, obviously to those that are unable to take care of themselves. And yes, we have an obligation to help them. I guess the question is, do we have an obligation to help people beyond like what they're willing to do to help themselves?
This is a really interesting question, because I think you're right that it's not, and you're not obligated to provide health care for your neighbors. Thinking about the organization of like social contract theory around individualism. However, my argument would be that if you think about society less as a collective of individuals and more of as an organic unit, it's less a question of does an individual have a duty than it is a question of is it beneficial for everybody to operate in a certain way.
Yes, I think that makes sense, and I would agree with that. I would say that the duty part, I think, extends as far as I think we all have a duty to make healthcare accessible to everybody and affordable. So if somebody can't afford to pay anything, it should still be accessible to them. I feel that every citizen has that duty to make these basic goods and services accessible. But it's like if somebody wants to be homeless and roam the streets, it's not really I don't really have a duty to force that person to buy a home and live in it.
No, certainly not.
And get a job or whatever.
That's too authoritarian for me.
Well, yeah. So,
but what I'm thinking is like Medicare for all.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So
right.
The part of the problem with Medicare for all is that everybody pays taxes.
Right.
And so essentially you are obligating everybody to provide for the healthcare of everybody else.
Yes.
And my argument would be that, well, from an individual standpoint, that's wrong. That you shouldn't be forced to account for the life of another. However, from like a beneficial standpoint, everybody can afford healthcare under that model, and it's very efficient, and it provides freedom of choice,
right,
in ways that our current system do not.
Well, I do think in some of these cases, even if I don't really have a moral obligation to provide specific things to specific people, I may still have a moral obligation to society, because society is better when these things are provided to every citizen.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why thinking about those sorts of things as commons,
right,
is a helpful model for understanding these dynamics.
Right. Because and that's kind of where I was actually going with this too. The loss of something like the commons, or the concept of a commons, basically comes back to society is just a collection of individuals, of everybody does what they feel is best for them personally. And when you start saying about what obligation do I have to provide goods and services to somebody else, well, it's not just a personal transaction. It really has to do with each person belonging to a particular community. And is society better off where everybody has a stake in the well-being of people in that community? I think that we do.
Yeah, well, and this is like, I think we're touching on the argument against this as well, because you hear like, so Donald Trump is vehemently against Medicare for all, universal health care.
Right.
And when you listen to him talk about it, what he says is, everybody will be able to afford healthcare, and you won't have access to the healthcare that you've worked so hard to earn. It's an appeal to that idea that this is better when a fewer number of people can benefit from it.
Well, he's basically, he doesn't want anything that's going to, well, let's put it this way. people that have his kind of money, I don't want to make a blanket statement here, so I got to be careful. Let's put it this way: it's a greater temptation for somebody with his kind of money to say, why should I have to do with less than what I can afford to have? If we want to let people have something, then let them have something at the level they can afford. But see, this would be, so the question is whether you could really have like a 2-tiered system. So basically it'd be like, let's say, okay, for those that can afford their own healthcare and insurance or whatever, you get full treatment. If you're on Medicare, well, you're only going to get the surgery if it's life-threatening. Like if you have to live with a certain amount of pain, then we'll just give you some cheap painkillers or something. Well,
and that, I think these problems arise from the faulty, dichotomies that get talked about in our political discourse, that if we adopted something like Medicare for all, we would also be abolishing the private insurance industry.
Yeah.
I'm enough of a realist to say, let the market take care of that. If the private insurance companies want to operate while Medicare for all is an option, let them do that. We don't need to abolish an industry just because we all collectively say we don't want to participate in that industry.
Right.
And I think this is where something like Red Vienna is a good model for this. So Red Vienna is the term used to describe how housing works in the city of Vienna.
Okay.
So back at some point, 1920s, 1930s, the Communist Party of Vienna was elected into the city government. And one of the things that they did was socialize the housing of Vienna. Mm-hmm. And they didn't, at the time, Vienna didn't really exist as we know it today. It was a lot of shanty town, is bad. So they built housing. And the housing they built wasn't commie blocks the way you would think about it. And it wasn't Section 8, the way we think about stuff in America, particularly where we're at in Chicago. There's quite the history of socialized housing not being the best. And so Red Vienna built essentially really nice apartments for everybody with common spaces and mixed uses, businesses being on the ground floors of apartment buildings, common courtyards. And these are sort of beautiful living spaces. Now they're not luxurious, but they're very livable. Mm-hmm. They're the standard of living for a European city.
Right.
Which is pretty good. And this housing model exists in Vienna to this day, where 88% of the population lives in public housing. Now, it's not free. There is rent to pay, but it's extremely cheap compared to a private housing market somewhere like Berlin, which is a very similar sort of city and living standard. It's much cheaper to live in Vienna. Now, not everybody lives in public housing. Some people choose to buy their own housing, and the ultra rich still have a way of being wealthy. But for everybody else, they get nice accommodations, and it's a common good, right? So everybody participates in maintaining the properties and, paying what needs to be paid to keep it nice for everybody, because everybody has a stake in maintaining the housing. I think that's a great model for healthcare and housing in America. That, okay, if you want to have private insurance and have, your specialty coverage or, whatever, go for it. You want to be the rich guy with your own, I've earned my healthcare sort of mindset. You can do that. But for the rest of us, we would benefit from treating this as a commons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so healthcare, you would say would be a priority in a commons. What other kind of things would you add?
Well, I think for me, it's
housing assistance.
Yeah, the necessities of survival. So, medical care, housing, food and water,
clothing.
Yeah, and clothing would be well, and that's something that like we've never done
We could-
and isn't done really anywhere.
Move all the poor people to nudist communities.
Well, I live pretty close to a nudist colony.
Really?
Yeah, the something Sunrise Club.
You go over and visit for lunch once in a while.
I've never been, but it is bizarre because it's not like I live in a warm, nice location. We're in cornfields in northern Indiana.
Yeah.
It's not nice here.
So is everybody
Why are you naked?
So is everybody out there in the cornfields like hee haw or something?
I guess so.
So yeah. So anyway, clothing, housing. So basic stuff. Now this is going to be still a little different than the commons, right? Because okay, so you're talking about in the commons how everybody in town, even the manor, the lord of the manor or whatever, was still like a part of the commons or whatever.
Yeah, everybody was an equally part of the commons. Like that, I think that's an important part of it. And this is a question of like, these are trickier questions because you're talking about how to govern something like the commons and how to give people a stake in the commons. Because I think that's important that like these common goods need to have, in order for them not to be abused, people need to have a stake in their governance.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess my question is, at this point in history, are we going to see something where socially, like you have people, everybody in town mixing it together at some point? Or are those kind of days over and we're basically striated into social classes and people are only going to have social interaction with people in their own strata and groups?
The cynical side of me says that the days are over.
Yeah.
That sort of communal living isn't really possible anymore. Unless something radical changes, like the collapse of society at large. Well, and I think this brings us to the other part of this conversation we wanted to get to. Church used to be part of the commons, and was subsidized by the state. You had tax-supported churches.
Yeah, state churches. I don't.
What?
Go ahead. I'm already against this, but go ahead.
I'm also against this. But part of the reasoning behind state-supported churches was that they were an important part of a healthy society because they provided common ground, common spaces, and socializing.
Right.
What is the modern version of that? What is the modern that? Because if we were looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, socialization is part of that. So what is the commons for that today? Do we need to all be part of a bowling league?
I don't know.
Does the state mandated bowling?
The local election polling place is probably the closest. And look how that unites us all together.
Right. Yeah. Very.
Well, anyway,
very
I'm being a little too
low stakes
cynical
environment.
Well, that's only, once or twice a year. I mean, I don't know. Like I say, maybe civic activities, like a community festival or like a high school graduation and that's not everybody, but I don't know. Like in terms of socialization, I think the thing is like, well, back in the day when this was a thing, I don't think there was like a whole lot of different forms of entertainment and social interaction for people to have as much as there is now. So, I mean, you might argue, like I would wonder, okay, so if we're going to add something as commons, something else that I wonder if it ought to be a government provided service for those that can't afford their own would be internet access.
Well, I think that's a strong argument that the internet is a public good. Did you hear the story about the guy from some Southeast Asian country who wrote a thesis on for a degree, for a computer science degree, on how you could write a code that stole people's internet access and you could provide it to anyone. And then he got rejected by the school, but I should go look up the story, and I'll put it in the sources. So he got kicked out of school for writing this thesis, because he was basically talking about, illegal activities.
Like pirating internet access.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you could write this code in a way that the internet service provider would have no idea that you are providing internet service for free to all these people. So he gets kicked out of school, and then he actually did it and proved that it works. And I think he went to prison.
Well, yeah, it kind of reminds me of OJ's book. I didn't do it, but if I did, this is how I would have done it.
Yeah. It's kind of the reverse of that, because he never actually got the opportunity to write the paper.
Well, yeah, I mean, but
he just like proved it. I'm just going to do it.
It's like he's already planned it out. So like, is it just a matter of time till he executes it?
Yeah, I think it's called the I love you.
Really?
Yeah, the I love you bug or something.
Wow. I'll have to look that up. I hadn't heard about that. Public education, I think, is another common good. That definitely should be a part of it. Emergency services like ambulance, fire, police, etc.
Yeah. Well, and those are things that already sort of belong to the commons.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they're more on the side of, say, the economic side of things, where people's needs are being met, where you can't really now, like police. That's something that would apply equally to everybody. Say same thing with firefighters. It's not like, okay, I guess it could. So like some billionaire is just going to have his or her own private fire station with full-time employees just playing cards until something catches on fire so they can go over and put it out. Even if you're the richest person in town,
used to be that firefighters were private.
Yeah.
You had to pay for service.
Yeah. But that's a thing here today where, I think no matter who you are, you're probably still going to rely on the public services that are being offered.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's part of the argument for like Medicare for all, is that like we should treat it like we do the fire department.
Right.
Right. It used to be that the fire department would go and put badges on the buildings that paid them to protect them.
Yeah. I'm glad nobody makes the argument that, gee, it's too bad that the firefighters put out fires for the poor people because we rich people could afford better service.
Right. Yeah. Well, you'd seem like a monster if you suggested that.
Well, and rightfully so. But I mean, it's, yeah, some of these arguments I really don't think hold up. But of course, it's probably a difference. Like the average person is not going to use the fire company services nearly as much as you would medical service.
Right.
Hopefully not. I mean, you'd have a real problem if you had the fire truck showing up your house as often as you have to go to the doctor. So,
well, but the counter argument to that is the fire department does provide things like
fried chicken.
Well, yeah. But like training on proper fire safety, that you do need to sort of stay up to date on that stuff, the same way that you need to go for a checkup at the doctor. You need to update your fire alarms and, replace your fire extinguishers and stuff like that. And the fire department does provide those services.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for
free.
Yeah. But that's another commons, so, that's another one of those things where if you go to a small town, like a local fire company or, with the ambulance service and all that, the volunteer fire company, they got to have these fundraisers. So like Saturday night, they're having chicken dinners or whatever.
Right.
And
Yeah. I mean, we have that in my town.
Oh yeah, everybody. There's a lot of people in town will show up, and it's like a social thing where you're supporting a public service, and you're also socializing with different people that you wouldn't otherwise socialize with.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They're probably, and I guess what I'm saying is maybe the commons can't be really revived today in the same form as it was years ago. We may have to actually have that revived in two separate senses. What I mean is, on one hand, we have to have public goods and services that are accessible and available to all citizens equally. On the other hand, there needs to be some sort of community building socially amongst people, so that it's not just, well, we're stakeholders because we want the fire truck to come to our house too if we need them, but it's also where you're getting out, you're supporting the community, and you're meeting people you wouldn't otherwise meet. And so you're at least, your stake in it is like you're at least participating in a community thing.
I do want to say, like, what comes to my mind is like farmers markets that local towns put on, and parks and recreation services.
Right.
However, I think the socialization is of a different quality in purely recreational events.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Than something like a commons that requires you to engage in conflict with your neighbors and do so civilly. So I think that's the difficult part, is like, how do we
arm wrestling contest at the farmer's market, or what?
Well, no, but more like town halls, where or like a public forum where the point is to come and discuss how do we govern the common goods that are shared amongst our neighbors.
Right. It just made me think of this because I was surfing around YouTube a week or two ago and came across some of these old clips from professional wrestling in the 70s and 80s when I was a kid, and they had this like whole thing for a while where different wrestlers would arm wrestle each other in the middle of the ring, and then whoever ended up losing would always jump up and bash the other guy with the chair he was sitting on, and they all ended the same way. So it was just it was kind of funny.
Just do that at the local level, yeah.
Yeah, crack the mayor over the head for losing to the mayor in an arm wrestling contest. But yeah, I get that. I mean, there's, I think the important thing is like that there be some sort of community projects, some sort of civic pride. Even, I don't know. These aren't really things that I don't know. Maybe do we encourage this by granting people like special access to, say, like certain parks or whatever? Like if you donate so many hours of community service, you can reserve the park for a birthday party for 3 hours or something, free of charge or something of that sort. I mean, I don't know. I'm not really sure how to go about that, but it really does have to do with, encouraging people. I think when, you have people like economically, like out of necessity, they're going to come together. Well, then that's just going to happen. The social interaction and all of that. And it's the same thing like with religion. I think back in the day when most people were afraid and like, if I don't go to church, I might burn in hell. I don't think most people think in those terms, not even the people that go every week. So you're not going to have the same kind of incentive. It's going to have to be like a positive incentive, to try to draw people in. Because, like I said, I think our form of government with social contract theory and even capitalism, they are very individualistically driven. And a lot of Western culture now is very much about the competition of self-interest. Well, that doesn't, and that's why you end up with groups like the Amish and the Mennonites and others who kind of go off by themselves, like the Shakers and others did for a while.
Yeah.
To basically, because you're not going to get that kind of community spirit in the broader culture anymore. You almost have to separate yourself if you want to maintain that kind of a communal attitude. I know it goes beyond that, but that is part, say, for example, of the Amish culture. Everybody accepts a responsibility to look out for each other. Nobody has to worry about their barn burning down or getting hit by a tornado because they know their neighbors will step in, help build them a new one.
Right. Well, and I think it's interesting to think about those like sort of like subsects of the culture, even thinking about like the new religious movements, cults, as maybe a reaction to the lack of a commons.
Right.
That because people are lacking that communal aspect, they're more susceptible to joining a cult or
that's exactly how
maybe
people
sacrificing ethics for their community.
Well, that's how people are drawn into cults. I mean, even if you listen to these, from years ago, you listen to these people that went to the hippie communes, even the Manson family, for Pete's sake. The guy did horrible things, had them do horrible things, but he paid a lot of personal attention to all these kids too. Now, I know he's exploiting them, but what I'm saying, the appeal of that was they were getting attention and a sense of belonging that they weren't getting somewhere else. So it does open people up for exploitation, but I think, that's what everybody's looking for. Well, that was part of the theme from Cheers, the old TV show.
Right, yeah.
Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name and they're always glad you came. And I think that's what everybody's looking for. Everybody's looking for some sense of belonging, some sense of community, some sense of, hey, you're important. And society is better. We've grown and grown and grown. And what we have to be careful is that we don't outgrow some of the more tight-knit social fabric. It's almost like if you have burlap, but the weave gets bigger and bigger with the holes bigger. It's like, it's not as strong as whenever there's a tightly knitted, or woven fabric.
Well, and I think, and we might have to come back to this topic for another episode, but I think this is where I would challenge local churches and maybe people who attend local churches to reevaluate their relationship with the community. Because I think for a lot of people that maybe don't feel comfortable in the church, they will still attend church if they are allowed to engage civilly in discourse about their differences with the church, as long as they're welcome there communally. And like, to sort of tie this into what you're saying, I think the church can and should provide places for people to socialize and form those tight-knit communities.
Right.
Without having to be ideologically uniform.
Mm-hmm. Well,
now that should take place across society, but I think this is particularly, the church is particularly capable of being a place like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not right now.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I grew up in the kind of church where, more moderate or liberal churches, were, disdained as and labeled as being nothing but social clubs. Okay.
Right. What a bad thing to be.
Well, yeah. I mean, but I mean, I wonder, like, did you read the Gospels? I mean, it's like Jesus just didn't stand up on a mountain preaching at people for his entire life. Like, he went to people's homes and dined with them. Like, he hung out with people that other people wouldn't hang out with. Like Zacchaeus, nobody wanted to go to that guy's house. I mean, he was a cheat. Jesus is like, hey, I'm going to your house. Get down there. I want you to go home and host me, And, but see, people like, that's the real challenge. The thing is, I'm sorry, but people don't have enough tolerance to match the demands of their own faith and religion. That's my personal take on it. And in fact, if you look at the polls, I've mentioned this before, the number one reason that people give that why they quit going to church is because of all this LGBTQ, all this hubbub. It just is, it's kind of mind boggling to a certain point. It's not even like people challenging central tenets of a faith. We're talking about cultural differences, really, what it is.
Right. Yeah.
And so these other people can talk about these other churches being social clubs, but I mean, is their own church any different? I mean, really, that's all this is about, is maintaining a certain culture at my home church. Yeah. And keeping out people who don't conform.
I do think that like there's probably enough for us to talk about here that we could go for another hour.
Yeah. We'll put this out for another discussion.
This discussion has been pretty broad across all of culture.
Right.
I think it would be helpful for us and good for our audience to get into the weeds of our own contexts. And,
right.
I mean, I mentioned earlier that Wesley lived through the death of the Commons, and he had opinions on the Commons and what the church should be. And I would go so far as to say that the Commons is also a result of Christianity, of the Acts 2 description of the church. And the Commons really takes root in medieval Europe after the domination of Christianity. So I would tie those ideologically together as part of the strengths of Western civilization. For all its flaws,
My contention is that Christianity was and still should be a libertarian, inclusive religion. It is not a religion. It's a religion that's actually fighting exclusion, elitism. Those were like all the things that Jesus preached about. Those are all the things that Paul preached about because he was trying to cast off his Pharisaism.
Yeah.
And Peter was the holdout, like of the whole group. Jesus has to talk to Peter several times. Paul has to confront Peter about, he still wasn't going to eat with Gentiles. See, it's this kind of elitism that they were fighting against, and it goes against human nature. And that's why I think that true Christian ideals, maintaining them is always going to be an uphill battle, because you've got, I'm sure, like the folks that I'm finding fault with here are sincere people. And I think they mean well, but I don't think they really understand what it is that Jesus sometimes was preaching about. They want to just see it in terms of like doctrine and their own personal mystical experience. And it was much
I wonder
more than,
how much of that is a result of the individualization of Western culture.
Exactly, because that wasn't the early interpretation of it. The early interpretation of Christianity was it was a communal thing. Everybody comes together, we break bread, we have the Eucharist, and then we have the love feast, we have the meal afterwards. And it was a breaking bread. It was everybody coming together under one common banner, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. There's no distinction male, female, Jew,
Right.
Gentile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a little preview of a future episode, audience. Not going to have time to go into this, but, so this does kind of come back to, let's put it this way. I don't know whether crediting Christianity for the creation of the commons I'd have to think and look into that, because the medieval Catholic,
I don't know if there's any like real historical evidence of that.
If there is, my guess would be it came from the monastic movement, because
I wonder if there is a tie there, because monastery life is definitely commune life.
Right. And so that was also kind of a countercultural counterbalance to the hierarchy of the church. And so these monks, like Thomas Aquinas, was not an elitist. Although, I wouldn't agree with all of his views, but the point is, like, Augustine, same thing. Like, they're not distinguishing themselves as having special authority from God and all this other kind of stuff. It was just kind of like a common appeal to everybody. And, these monasteries, they really did, and convents, they really did foster, especially some of these orders became mendicant orders, where they went out and, begged for food or begged for people to help sustain, because they wanted to be able to identify with the poor.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking like Benedictines, Franciscans, and Jesuits are all, they take vows of poverty. I believe all three of them do.
Yeah. St. Francis, kissing the sores of lepers. Anyway. But with that is I think that's a worthwhile episode. But this,
I think the commons goes all the way back even into the Old Testament, but we will get into that.
Well, there you
future
go.
episodes.
Oh, well, yeah. There are certain things there. Yes. So, we can talk about that.
The framework of it is there.
Are you talking about the Levite cities and things like that, or
that things? And the distribution of property?
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. All right. Well, so let's wrap this one up. We'll put a ribbon on this, and we will maybe revisit some of these themes here in future episodes. We've enjoyed this, and if the world doesn't end before, we'll be back next week with another episode. We hope your day is uncommonly good, as we said, and take care. God bless.